It's a tragic story that raises some thorny questions about the nature of suicide and the limits of criminal culpability. This past July, police found 18-year-old Conrad Roy in a parked car behind a K-Mart in Fairhaven, dead from apparent carbon monoxide poisoning. Now his friend Michelle Carter is being charged with involuntary manslaughter in his death. Prosecutors claim she encouraged Roy to kill himself, even urging him to get back in his car and finish the job when he started having second thoughts. But Carter's attorney says his client shouldn't be held responsible for a decision that someone else freely made.
They feel badly that the Roy boy, young man, took his own life, but that's what it was. He took his own life. It was a voluntary decision on his part to end his own life, not a homicide. Michelle Carter did not cause his death.
But did Michelle Carter play a decisive role? Joining me now to talk more about that are Jack Cunha, an attorney and former president of the Massachusetts Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and Robert Mendoza, a neuropsychologist at Boston Forensic Associates who frequently consults in homicide cases. Welcome to both of you. Jack, let me start with you. What kind of legal precedent is there for criminal charges being brought in the case where someone else killed himself?
I know of none. I assume that what the government is proceeding on a theory of reckless homicide, which would be a manslaughter, that somebody acted so recklessly with a reckless disregard for life and that it caused the death. But there's where the rub is. Did it cause the death?
Yeah.
The question here is not whether, well, first of all, let me just say this. We're assuming that this young lady did what they said she did.
That the facts are
right,
yeah,
and we're also assuming that she did it with a certain intent. Who knows what she thought? Even assuming that she said to him, "Get back in the car," was she kidding? Did she think he was serious? We don't know that.
Right,
but let's just assume, for purpose of the conversation, that she did what the government said she did. Is it manslaughter? I can't see the causation issue. He was clearly in distress, but because we know that, but we know that after the fact.
Right.
And the question is not whether there's a wrong, because if what she did is offensive, but does the law have a remedy for it? And I don't think so, not this remedy.
Robert Mendoza, let me ask you from a mental health professional's point of view, does the idea that someone could push someone else into taking their own life, does that jibe with your profession's understanding of how suicide works?
Certainly. This particular case, and I think what's interesting, there's the legal culpability, which the legal system will play out with, and there may be some interaction with essentially the moral culpability. What we've seen so far from the text are that this seems to be a person, Ms. Palmer, who really did influence this young man in some fashion. They certainly had some sort of relationship. But like most cases, and I work a lot for defense attorneys on murder cases, the information will slowly come out. We need to know a lot more about this relationship. Apparently they had a relationship where she called herself the girlfriend, and friends said, I don't even think they've gone out on a date. We don't know about her history at all, because the defense obviously won't lay that out. There's really only two options here. She's either a really, really terrible, terrible person, as it's being portrayed now, or there are other issues. And until you explore that very thin veneer of adolescence and really begin to look at what else might be going on, I think it's a little difficult to tell what other factors were influencing her behavior that so far we've seen to be just horrific.
Let me ask you, before I bring Jack back in here, just to step back from the criminal aspect of this case for a moment and talk more broadly about how psychologists and psychiatrists understand suicide. Is it right to think of it, as the attorney for Michelle Carter suggested, as a decision freely made by an independent actor? Or if someone is on the verge of taking their own life, are they by definition so troubled that they cannot really be thought to be acting in sort of a free and lucid way?
So there's a philosophical discussion about whether or not we actually have the will to be able to determine our own lives.
At this point.
Then there's sort of the mental health component. What factors go into a person and contributory issues of suicide? My understanding from what I've read is that the young man attempted to kill himself a year and a half even before that. And it sounds like there was some sort of mental health history on his part. So there's already a predisposition for possibly some events to have occurred regarding self-harm. The degree to which the young woman may have had a relationship and may have influenced him is hard to tell, but certainly that can be a factor related to suicide.
Jack, let me ask you, I was trying to think of cases that might have resembled this one. I couldn't come up with anything, but then I thought of the Phoebe Prince case and the fact that criminal charges were brought in connection with alleged bullying, which is different. It wasn't people saying, Phoebe Prince, you should take your own life, but it was people allegedly creating a level of distress that caused her to do this. And obviously that was very controversial. What about that analogy? Is that potentially instructive in any way?
Actually, you know, when we were in my office, we were talking about this because it fascinates us as lawyers as it does anybody, you know, lay lawyer, whatever. I don't think that's an apt analogy because it is action against the person. There's no allegation, as I understand it, that her actions somehow tortured him to the extent that he felt he didn't want to live anymore. The notion is that somehow she encouraged him to do it, something that he apparently wanted to do anyway. If he didn't want to do it, then it's hard for me to imagine that a text from her is going to cause him to go back and kill himself.
But see, here's the issue that we don't know about. I've read a few dozen texts that she sent that have been published. Apparently there were around 1,000 texts. Until you get the nature and extent of those texts and then what led up to that moment in time, I think the thing that I found in every murder case I've worked, people are fascinated with the crime itself. My fascination are what are the events that led up to that moment in time. That's where you learn more about what can be attributable to individuals and their responsibility, whether it be moral or legally.
But even legally, those texts might be very important because if the government is proceeding on a theory of recklessness by her, then the history of their relationship as revealed in the texts, and texts are only one aspect of any relationship, I mean, clearly, and maybe not the most profound one, but there still is going to be a history to show what, in fact, was she thinking at that time? What, in fact, was he thinking at that time? And again, we don't know the answer to those things.
I think I'd want to go back, though, and emphasize that the focus is going to be on the young man's history, at least at this point, that he had a mental health history, at least with regard to potential suicide, and that he was obviously distraught and eventually did suicide that day. But it's her history that I think that we're going to have to spend a lot of time. And I teach forensic doctoral students, and we were chatting a little bit about this the other day, and one person said, well, geez, what about Munchausen, Munchausen by proxy, or as it's called now, factitious disorder towards another person or yourself.
Remind me, that's when for example, a parent would actually create symptoms in a child?
Right, in an effort for a secondary gain for themselves, and that's by proxy. It's now called factitious disorder towards another person, and now factitious disorder towards self if you did it to yourself. This doesn't look like that kind of case. Some of the aspects of her presentation are consistent, but again, you either have to go with the assumption that this is just a really, really bad kid, or you have to go with the assumption that there are other things going on that we're not yet privy to.
There's a distinction between somebody who's acting poorly for psychological reasons and somebody who's committed a criminal act, and I don't see a criminal act.
You mentioned the Munchausen by proxy, or I can't remember the new name.
Factitious disorder.
Thank you. I actually wonder if there is an element of that at play here, in that Michelle Carter, again, according to what we are learning from reports in the media, that she, after Conrad Roy took his own life, she almost luxuriated in the status that she received as the ex-girlfriend or the friend or whatever she was, the person who knew him, sort of talking about how she had struggled to dissuade him and he wouldn't do it, participating in efforts to increase suicide awareness. So that actually sounds a little Munchausen-esque to me.
You know, and there are two other factors that come into this. I mentioned that thin veneer that we talk about. The first thing is that apparently a friend of hers said she took over his work that he was doing for charity, and she just assumed ownership of it. Right. The second thing is other friends have commented, and again, we don't know these until it comes out. Other friends have commented and said she always sort of needed some kind of attention. Mm-hmm. So that, again, you're right to begin to look at that. The question is, does she meet the full criteria? Jack is right, though, to say, does it meet the legal criteria?
All right, Robert Mendoza, Jack Cunha, thank you both.